You have heard that it was said from people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave the gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. During the mid-1500s, as Europeans began to travel to the New World, one of those who traveled was a man by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a Spanish priest and was traveling along with some of the first Spanish settlers. And as they entered the land, he was able to see the way that those living in the land originally were treated by the Spanish in the name of Christ. There was raping, there was pillaging, there was destruction, there was violence, and there were forced conversions. As a priest, it was up to De las Casas to help with the baptism. As often happened, it was a forced kind of baptism, that you were baptized or you were killed. And many times when you were baptized, you were immediately sent into slavery. De las Casas, not only was he a priest, but he gained wealth and prestige from this system. But one day he began to read through scripture, and he began to have his heart and mind changed. Bartolomé de las Casas was one of the first Europeans to advocate for the rights of the people living in the land and against the use of Africans as slaves. He did so because he understood and came to understand the image of God was in the indigenous people as much as it was in the Europeans. And in today's text, we begin to shift a little bit in Matthew chapter 5. We shift a little bit from the beginning part of the Sermon on the Mount to the more practical parts. And if you remember what we've seen so far, Jesus is giving us the goal of our lives, which is to be with God, to the teleos, to build God's kingdom, to partner with God, to build God's kingdom. Jesus is also giving us a vision to see the world the way God desires it. We see this in the Beatitudes, to see that God is present in this world and to desire God's goodness in this world, and again, to partner with God to get there. And as we saw last week, Jesus is encouraging and inviting us into a new humanity, one that is directly connected to the story of Genesis, where God forms humanity in his own image. In the ancient world, in the times that Genesis was written and spoken down, images and idols, which are the same word, by the way, are closely connected to the gods that they represent. They had some of the same certain attributes. The gods lived, it was believed, within these idols. What's interesting is in the ancient Near East, the only people who were considered images of the gods were kings and rulers and priests in the world, people with high power and might and wealth. But the story of Scripture begins with the very fact that humankind, male and female, are all filled with the very image of God. As the story goes on, though sin disrupts that image, the image still has value. Just like if you have a dollar bill that's all crumpled up and faded, it's still worth $1. We have value, and we lose focus on this very key idea in Scripture, that everyone around us has value, that everyone is created in the image of God. And instead, we turn it into a competition that leads us to miss the joys of the new humanity that Jesus is offering us through partnership with the Spirit. So we come today to a section in the Sermon on the Mount where it's often seen that these are things that are spoken by Jesus for super spiritual people, people who are above and beyond everybody else, or they're only for church people. But remember last week that we are called to be the salt and light. Remember from last week's video that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. This is for each of us. These next few weeks are going to be very personal. They're going to be very difficult to hear and live into because Jesus is speaking to us at the very root of our problems and the very root of how sin has wrapped us up. And so the first step for us is to recognize first that you are an image of God, created by God for God's purposes in the world, and that everyone else around you is an image of God as well. Today's text begins in Matthew 5, verse 21, where Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said of people long ago, you shall not murder. Anyone who murders is subject to judgment." Jesus begins with this kind of sentence that you have heard it said. We'll see this repeated numerous times. This is the way it was understood. You don't murder, right? We all agree, we can probably all agree that murder is not a good thing. We value life in all its forms, and we know that humans are created in God's image. This makes sense in a surface reading. Remember, though, that the law is grace that shows us how wrapped up we are in sin. So Jesus wants to show us that even if we've never murdered, we'd still have the same attitude more times than we'd probably care to admit. It's like walking through the tunnels of a cave. Jesus has shown us the surface understanding as we typically tend to want to go. He's shown us that murder is wrong. We agree with that. But now we're going to walk deeper into the caves of our hearts and our minds and our lives to see that this is more than just taking the life of someone. So Jesus continues in verse 22, "But I tell you," again, a phrase we're going to see repeated over the next few weeks. "Anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And anyone who says to his brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Jesus says to us in this text, anger is at the heart of murder. Understand that anger in itself isn't a bad thing. We see God get angry. We see Jesus get angry. But their anger is based towards powers and institutions that are oppressing others, not towards specific individuals. The anger that Jesus speaks of here is different than that kind of anger that we feel when powerful institutions seem to be out against us. This is a selfish hatred of others. It's not some petty annoyance like you don't like somebody's cooking, but instead it's more than that. This anger is a pattern of competition and hatred of someone or a group that gets in the way of God's desires and God's vision for this world. I mean, look at how Jesus describes it. He says, again in verse 22, again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. Again, anybody who says, "You fool," is answerable to the fires of Gehenna. Now what Jesus is saying here is this: if you say to someone you're an idiot or you're stupid or you're empty-headed, you even think that, Jesus says, you are heading down the slope that leads to the same type of patterns that murder commits in our hearts. It's this idea that our very lives and our very thoughts affect the way we live, even if we don't say them out loud. Even if we look at someone and think, "You are such an idiot," or we respond in that way to other people. Jesus is warning us here that that very attitude corrupts our hearts and blinds our vision, so much so that we are in danger of the fire of hell, or as Jesus says in the Greek, Gehenna. Gehenna was a valley that existed right outside the walls of Jerusalem in the Old Testament. It was a place of child sacrifice, a burning trash heap, a place of death and destruction. It's where you would drag all the carcasses of animals and your trash of the city to throw and burn. And Jesus is saying, this is the place you are headed. This is the slope you are on if you allow your heart to be corrupted in that way. But why? Because again, like De Las Casas at the beginning, we are all created in the image of God. And the very moment we belittle that image in others or in ourselves, we are showing our true hearts. And this is what Jesus came to liberate and rescue us from. And so Jesus continues with something that is just as dramatic and just as important for us. What are we going to do? Jesus calls us to a life of radical reconciliation. In verses 23 through 26, he says, look, if you're on your way to make an offering at the temple and you're going to the altar, but you remember that one of your brothers or sisters has something against you, then go and reconcile yourselves to them. And then make your offering. Or if you're on your way to court, reconcile that situation as soon as you can. Don't be greedy. Don't drag it on. Don't attack one another. Because in doing this to each other, whether it be at the temple or at the court, your heart is being slowly corrupted and you are sliding down a hill that is not the way God intends for you. Instead, seek reconciliation. Seek an end to the strife. Seek a way forward together with others so that you can see the image of God in the other person. And we're going to see, Jesus is going to present more examples of this, and we're going to end up with some really powerful examples of this as we move along. But this reveals just how important relationships are to God. That the way we treat one another is important to us. And that's part of what this means. I mean, think about you and I, how quick it is and easy it is for us to get upset, to call people idiots, whether we're watching the news or we're driving the car or on social media. We judge and attack each other all of the time, whether it's in our thoughts or our hearts or our minds. And this very text tears down that attitude that we have and calls us to be a people who recognize the image of God in those around us. Because if we don't, Jesus is saying that the moment we do this, the moment we treat others in this way, is the very moment that we say the cross and the work of Jesus does not matter or is not for the people that we are attacking and judging. When we say that somebody is not important, that someone is an idiot, that they're not valuable to us, we say they are less human, and it makes us feel good about ourselves, but it also destroys the very purpose that Jesus came for. So I don't know about you, but this text challenges me to change and to work and ask the Spirit to work on my thoughts and my words and my actions towards other people. And I suspect that it's the same for you. And so as we do that, I encourage you this week to be honest with God, to ask God to help you see the places where you are entering into this very attitude that Jesus is talking about, and to ask the Spirit to help you do the hard work of being set free. And may the peace of Christ be with you.